The void maw reeked of stale alcohol, burnt circuits, and the distinct scent of danger. Dim lighting flickered over a room packed with warlords, mercenaries, and crime lords, each more ruthless than the last. Every conversation was a whispered negotiation, a threat laced with forced politeness. No one came here without something to gain, or something to lose. Then, the human walked in. Every eye in the room shifted. Conversations paused. A Deathworlder? Here? The disbelief was almost tangible. Some chuckled, amused at the audacity. Others narrowed their eyes, calculating. A towering Zarkin enforcer stepped forward, his scaled bulk casting a shadow over the newcomer. His voice was a gravelly rumble. "Wrong place, human." A clear message: leave while you still can. The human didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared with a calm so absolute it felt unnatural. The silence stretched. A flicker of hesitation crossed the Zarkin's face. He stepped back, confused, before muttering a curse and slinking away. The room's tension snapped like a wire. Conversations resumed, but now, whispers carried a new weight. Who was this human? And why weren't they afraid? 250 to 500 words. Unbothered, the human strode past the brawlers, the gamblers, the assassins leaning against the walls. Their gaze was locked onto a single spot, the high-stakes poker table at the center of the room. Krivex, the Cephalon crime lord who owned the Void Maw, sat at the head of the table. His glistening tendrils coiled lazily as he observed the new arrival with amusement. Around him sat a collection of power, each player a name whispered in fear across the sector. The human reached into their coat and placed a credit chip onto the table. It glowed softly, displaying the claim number for an abandoned station in disputed space. The kind of collateral that turned heads. Krivex chuckled. "You know the stakes here, Deathworlder?" The human nodded. The other players shared glances, entertained. A human trying their luck in a game played by those who conquered empires? This would be easy money. Krivex motioned to an empty seat. "Let's see if your kind is as lucky as they say." The first hand was dealt. The human's movements were measured, picking up cards with deliberate slowness, eyes scanning the table. The aliens barely noticed. To them, this was routine. The Threxian warlord, an aged brute with scars that told of 100 battles, played aggressively. He bet high, bared his teeth with every raise, a predator hunting weak prey. The pirate queen smirked through every hand, daring opponents to challenge her. The syndicate boss played with relaxed arrogance, already considering how he'd spend his winnings. The human folded on weak hands. Matched bets on decent ones. Won a few, lost a few. Unremarkable. Or so it seemed. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The human wasn't just playing. They were watching. Not the cards, but the people. The warlord clenched his fist when bluffing. The pirate tapped her rings against the table when uncertain. The diplomat hesitated before every high-stakes call. Subtle details. Patterns of behavior. The human stored them all away. A hand came up, nothing special, but enough to push forward. The warlord raised the bet aggressively. The human called without hesitation. A test. The warlord smirked. "Not a smart move, Deathworlder." The cards were revealed. The human's hand was better by a narrow margin. The warlord's smirk faded. No celebration came from the human. No gloating. Just a quiet, knowing glance that made the warlord shift in his seat. The human collected the winnings without a word. The game continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The Deathworlder wasn't just another fool to be bled dry. They were hunting. And the predators at the table were starting to realize they weren't the ones in control anymore. The game stretched on, and the human remained unreadable. No fidgeting, no nervous glances, no hesitation. Just measured movements, precise calculations. The aliens at the table were used to breaking opponents through sheer pressure, but this Deathworlder didn't crack. A pile of chips steadily grew in front of the human. Small wins, nothing too flashy, but enough to keep the others wary. They weren't playing to get rich. They were playing to survive, and something more. The warlord's patience wore thin. His bets became reckless, trying to bully the human into submission. The diplomat glanced at their dwindling stack, already weighing when to cut their losses. The pirate queen tapped a finger against her dagger's hilt, watching the human too closely now, suspicion growing. The human didn't need to win every hand. They needed control. And they were getting it. Krivex, amused at first, now observed in silence. He had seen power struggles play out in many ways, but never like this. No blaster, no threats, no intimidation, just the slow, methodical unraveling of confidence. The human raised a bet. The syndicate boss hesitated. He had been cheating discreetly all night, slipping extra cards where no one noticed. Or so he thought. He smirked, acting as if he had everything under control, then slid more chips forward. The human's gaze lingered on him for a second longer than necessary. Just enough to make him shift in his seat. A new hand. The boss grew overconfident. He played big, certain of victory. The human matched him, then pushed more forward. Let's raise the stakes. The crime boss chuckled, pretending to be unfazed. What do you have left to wager, Deathworlder? The human didn't blink. The bar. The table went silent. Even Krivex raised a brow. The boss sneered, assuming it was a bluff. He agreed to the wager, placing his own claim, a fleet of gunships. He expected to win, after all. The cards were revealed. His face twisted when he realized what had happened. The human had known. The whole time. The cheats, the fake confidence, the moments of hesitation. They had played him, piece by piece, maneuvering him straight into his own downfall. Krivex leaned forward, intrigued. The room watched as the crime boss sat there, silent, trying to process what had just happened. Security moved before he could protest. 2 enforcers grabbed him by the arms. He snarled, tried to pull free, but it was pointless. Krivex laughed, shaking his head. You got played, friend. The boss was dragged out. The humans stacked their newly acquired winnings with methodical precision, saying nothing. The game wasn't over. But now, the table knew the truth. The human wasn't here to gamble. They were here to take everything. The warlord cracked first. His anger had been simmering since the start, but now it boiled over. He slammed a fist on the table, rattling the chips. You think you're clever, human? His voice carried the weight of 100 battles, but there was an edge of doubt now, the first sign of a crumbling foundation. The human remained still, unreadable. The warlord bared his teeth, trying to reassert dominance. It worked on his soldiers, on his enemies in the field. It did nothing here. Another hand. The human called every bluff. Matched every challenge. The warlord's pile shrank, his confidence with it. The pirate queen watched with new calculation. She had underestimated the human before, assuming they were lucky. Now she knew better. They weren't just playing cards. They were dismantling the people sitting across from them. The diplomat adjusted their collar, feeling the weight of their dwindling resources. The human never looked at the chips, only at the players. They spoke just enough to plant seeds of doubt, to guide their opponents where they wanted them to go. The warlord made a final, desperate push. He threw in everything, his remaining wealth, control over one of his lesser planets, a desperate bid to reclaim his pride. The human didn't hesitate. All in. The cards were dealt. The warlord's hand was strong. A near-perfect play. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the human, waiting for their reaction. Nothing. No flicker of worry, no hesitation. Just the quiet certainty that had haunted him all night. The human laid down their cards. A better hand. A hand that shouldn't have been possible. The warlord stared at it. His breath came short, disbelief etched into his every movement. His defeat wasn't just about the cards. It was everything leading up to it, the control, the precision, the way he had been slowly backed into a corner until there was no escape. His jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to fight, to reclaim something of himself. But there was nothing left to claim. He stood, towering over the table. His presence had once carried fear. Now it was hollow. His voice was low, almost a whisper. You knew from the beginning. The human gave a small nod. A long silence. Then, the warlord turned and walked away. No explosions of anger. No grand threats. Just the quiet understanding that he had been outplayed. The remaining players watched, now fully aware of what had just happened. The game wasn't about wealth or luck. It had never been. The human had taken their measure and stripped them bare. And they weren't finished yet. Kryvex exhaled through his tendrils, watching the aftermath with amusement. The warlord was gone. The diplomat had folded long ago. The pirate queen sat back, calculating whether it was worth pushing forward. The human didn't look at her. They didn't need to. The table had already been won. A final hand. A courtesy at this point. The pirate played, but it was half-hearted. She knew when the tide had shifted. The moment the human raised the bet, she smirked and flicked her wrist, throwing in her cards. I know when I'm beaten. She stood, stretched, and gave the human a nod. You ever need a fleet, call me. Then she was gone. Kryvex was the last one left. He had watched it all unfold, piece by piece. The human had done something no one else had managed, taken control of a place that had never belonged to anyone. Not through brute force, not through reputation, but through sheer, undeniable dominance. The human reached forward, picking up the final winnings. It wasn't about money. It never had been. Kryvex chuckled. So what now, Deathworlder? The human didn't respond immediately. They didn't need to. The room had already changed. The bar had changed. Word would spread. Deals would shift. A new power had just walked in, and they hadn't needed a single weapon to take control. The bartender poured a drink with shaking hands. The human lifted the glass, took a slow sip. The game was over. And the void maw belonged to them now.